I look at who I am today and where I've gone with my life, and it's a direct reflection of growing up on a whaler with my dad in the river, waking up at 5 a.m. to go, trot lining with my sister, swimming, with like silt mustaches on our upper lip, dad taking us hunting in the wintertime and sitting in the blind. I mean, this was all that type of Eastern Shore childhood, running through the cornfields, like swimming in drainage ponds. Yeah. That magical stuff that you really take for granted when you're a kid is exactly the type of thing that I'm trying to, convey when I talk to audiences or I teach groups of students here, that kind of stuff. But no, genuinely, I look at, I would consider myself a product of environmental education. When I was in 5th grade, like most Kent County students, I went to Echo Hill Outdoor School and got muddy and filthy and cold and wet, but also amazed and had an amazing trip and, went out on the dead rise and went in the swamp and was covered with mud from head to toe. And I ended up loving it so much that my dad signed me up for a canoe trip, and then I went to the camp, and now it all kind of snowballs. I think maybe not for every single student is that going to be a moment that changes their life, but for plenty of kids it is, and without environmental education that wouldn't happen. People know the bay because they eat it, or they say, you can sail on it, and now recreation's become the thing, but traditionally speaking, people knew the bay because they ate it. And it's nice that we still have that connection, that people still think about, crabs and want crabs when they visit. You visit other places and, there might be a really great connection with like Boston baked beans, for example, but they don't make you care about something, in the bigger picture. Like the fact that we've got these foodways in the Chesapeake really does bring you back to this idea that, it's a special place. I feel like oysters have a deep connection with people in the Chesapeake, and how to this current, to the current day, they defined sustenance for the early settlers and the Indians. You see their middens when you go out to Eastern Neck Island. You can see that sort of scrum of oyster shell that still, erodes away in a beach from people eating them over thousands of years. And then the colonists ate them, and everyone continued to consume them just sort of voraciously, but without really thinking. The road from Chestertown to Quaker Neck was paved in oyster shell. That's an incredible amount of oysters. And Chestertown was not a big place. That just tells you how many oysters people were consuming. And today, they have these town hall meetings on increasing sanctuaries, establishing new ones, and they are so contentious. People feel so emotionally connected to something that doesn't have a face. And I think it says so much about how resonant oysters continue to be. For something so humble, they have such an incredible place in the environment, filtering the water, as a foundational species. But they're also this sort of keystone of our culture, where you've got this whole waterman tradition, and, you come to visit St. Michael's, and, Navy Point, where the museum is located, when you dig down, it's all compacted oyster shells from this incredible fishery and harvest and processing that was going on throughout the Chesapeake in the 19th century. So the book will be about all that, and we'll talk about the people and the stories that make the Chesapeake oyster come alive. So the public perception within the Chesapeake is still that oysters are like an everyman food. I think people can easily remember a day when you could go and have an all-you-could-eat oyster bar, which, seems a little scary now when you think about it, like what's wrong with them? But, I can remember, oysters being, 20 cents a piece or less. And for some watermen, that's still what they're getting wholesale. There's a real division between sort of the wild harvest and watermen, and then this movement towards aquaculture, and especially in Maryland. It's interesting. It's not as contentious in Virginia. it all goes back to the turn of the last century when around, the 1880s and 90s, you had this peak of the oyster harvest and then it declined. And Virginia's reaction was to start private leasing, bottom leasing, and saying, if you can have this bottom, this unproductive bottom, and if you can make it productive, then you can sell the oysters. And in Maryland, what they ended up doing was kind of tethering oyster harvesting to antiquated methods. So that's why you still had sail dredging, for example, very old-fashioned, to kind of slow them down, slow the harvest down. And so Virginia's got this precedent to allow you to harvest oysters, if you have a bottom lease, whereas Maryland has this precedent that says, we're going to stick to a wild harvest. And so Maryland's kind of behind the ball a bit. It's interesting to see that, Virginia's, I'd say, about 15 years ahead of us in terms of where their aquaculture industry is.
Wow.
But, you look up and down the East Coast, and this is not a new idea. Raising oysters when you deplete your wild harvest goes back to the Romans. So it's something that you see not just, the United States sort of struggling with, but also England had a very similar oyster boom and then decline due to, all the same factors that we had, where you had railroads and canning and preservation techniques, and they had huge oyster beds. And now they have moved on to aquaculture. And France, it's the same thing. To me, crabs are contentious, sure. Everybody wants more crabs, and we can agree on that. And crabs are pretty easy to restore in the sense that their population goes up and down, but their life cycle is so short that if you say limit the harvest of females for a year, you'll see a pretty quick turnaround. With oysters, their lifespan is so much longer, their life cycle is so much longer, and their whole system is so delicate. Crabs can sort of move around. Oysters aren't going anywhere. So, that, again, it goes back to this idea that oysters are this incredibly rich and complex and nuanced organism, not just in terms of their biology, but in terms of the role that they play in our culture. And, I love an oyster on the half shell as much as the next person, and it wasn't until I started working here that I appreciated how much more there was to that story. And it's one of those things that I really think captures your imagination. Oyster pirates and, the concept of, the immigrants being brought in from New York to work in these packing plants in Baltimore in the 19th century that didn't speak a word of English, and were sort of taken fresh off the boat, to these pictures that you see, even of here in St. Michael's, of there being, oyster shells 3 stories high.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a shift. I think either Maryland will view watermen as so important to the culture that it will, find ways to facilitate the harvest for them, or to subsidize the harvest for them in a way, sort of like we do with farmers. Nationally, I think that would be one way that I could see watermen continuing. But any watermen working in the industry now will tell you they feel choked by regulation, and they feel like if they would tell their children not to do it. And the profile of the watermen is older, older and older. It's really tough for a young guy getting into the business now. I think we'll see a growth in aquaculture. I hope it doesn't transplant all wild harvest, because we really will lose something valuable that is a part of our sense of place here in the Chesapeake that you can't find again, you can't create again. At the Maritime, the whole reason the Maritime Museum is here is because the waterman's way of life has been changing and diminishing since the 1960s. When this museum was established, it was because, a group of people here recognized that these boats, these tools, these traditions were going by the wayside, and no one was collecting them and preserving them. This change in the oyster harvest in the Chesapeake is just one new addition to that. And to me, it's part of that long continuous story since the time period of the Indians. And that's the beauty of oysters, I think.
Yeah.
They connect us all the way back to that time period.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm optimistic in terms of, do I see the bay's oyster industries growing? I do, but I think it's going to involve a painful change in terms of what kind of harvest that's going to be.